Hello my dear friends and family, operator Starsky here, and today we're going to talk about something very unique. Ukrainian FP drones, the FP-1 and the newer FP-2, made by Firepoint. Very recently we've seen strikes on Russian power generation facilities, on a number of Russian oil refineries, attack on fuel storages in occupied Crimea, and also strikes that damaged an ammunition depot in Donetsk. In a lot of those cases, Ukrainian footage and statements point to FP drones designed by Firepoint. So my friends, today we will look in more detail at what those drones are, why Ukraine needs to develop long-range drones, and what makes FP-1 and FP-2 special, and also why they're giving the Russian invaders some real headache. Let's get into it. You may ask, why did Ukraine need something like FP-1 and FP-2, having that huge arsenal of long-range drones? Well, you know pretty well that for years the Russian terrorists were using Iranian Shahed type drones and other cheap kamikaze UAVs to hit Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Ukraine needed its own long-range and cheap mass-producible weapon that could reach deep into Russia's rear areas, places where the invaders thought they were safe. Before FP-1, Ukraine used a mix of modified hobbyist-style attack drones, Western loitering munitions, and of course missiles, but those were either expensive or had shorter reach. So a homegrown long-range kamikaze drone made absolute sense. It meant low cost, easy to produce in numbers, and able to strike refineries, depots, and power plants far behind the front lines. Firepoint answered that need with FP-1 and then later with FP-2. Now, what do we actually know about FP-1 and FP-2? Keep in mind that some details are kept secret for security, but open reporting gives us a pretty clear picture. The FP-1 is a long-range one-way attack drone. You can think of it as a cheap guided flying bomb built to go deep and hit valuable Russian targets. According to public sources, the FP-1 ranges up to around 14 to 1600 kilometers and modular warheads roughly in the 60 to 120 kilogram class, depending on the version. It is a propeller aircraft, relatively simple airframe made of plywood or composite structures, a small piston engine, and a guidance stack that mixes inertial navigation with satellite navigation, plus some resilience to jamming. FP-1s were designed to be produced fast and cheaply, with some outlets estimating production scaling from dozens a month to many hundreds or even thousands a month during this year, 2025. The FP-2 is a related design, but built for heavier punch at a shorter to mid ranges. Reports say that FP-2 carries a much larger warhead, with figures often quoted around 100 to 105 kilograms of high explosives. That means when an FP-2 hits a fuel depot or an ammo storage, the damage is far greater than a light kamikaze drone. FP-2 also seems designed for first-person view in some missions. Range estimates for FP-2 are lower than FP-1 because it's a heavier, much more destructible machine, but still enough to reach many strategic sites in Russian rear areas. The navigation and guidance appear to be a mix of GPS or GLONASS satellite navigation, inertial guidance, and operator control for terminal guidance. And the airframe and engine choices keep the production costs still very low while allowing a bigger and heavier warhead. So how do they compare, for example, to the Russian Iranian Shahed drones? Because those are also pretty simple and cheap and have been a big problem for Ukrainian civilians. In fact, at some point Ukraine learned how to build its own versions of drones using a similar design. For example, FP-1 was built to be long-range and relatively cheap per unit, while FP-2, as I already mentioned, trades some range for a much bigger warhead. In plain numbers reported in different sources, FP-2 warheads are often estimated to be roughly double what a typical Shahed carries, meaning twice the explosive mass and thus a larger crater, bigger secondary fires at fuel sites, and more likely sympathetic detonations at ammo storages. At the same time, FP designs aim to be easier to produce in Ukrainian workshops with modular parts and an emphasis on making them resilient to jamming and detection. So basically the FP family is more advanced in guidance and payload options, yet still cheap enough to be produced at scale. And that's what makes them so uncomfortable for the Russian invaders. Why does that matter in practice? Well, if an FP-2 with 100 kg of warhead reaches a fuel storage or refinery, the damage is not only a local fire. It can take pipelines, pumping stations, and whole refinery units offline for weeks. And same with those big Russian ammo dumps. One big explosion can set off secondary detonations and wreck large stockpiles. So even a relatively small number of FP drones used precisely can create outsized logistical pain for the Russian invaders. And that is why we've seen targeted strikes on power plants, on refineries, and on fuel depots in Crimea and other rear areas, and we can expect the number of those strikes to expand. A lot of people ask, are those drones expensive to produce? And the answer is not really, comparatively. The cost of a FP-1 is much lower than many missiles and in around the same ballpark or even lower than Iranian Shaheds. The whole idea basically revolves around cheap mass production. Firepoint, the company behind the FP series, reportedly scaled production fast and aimed to make these in large numbers instead of one expensive precision missile, for example. This way, Ukraine can make many of them. They can use them for deep strikes and still keep costs manageable for the Ukrainian budget. That changes the math of the war, my friends. We're talking quality where it counts and numbers where it matters. Now, what does this mean going forward? Ukraine seems to be ramping production and diversifying these systems. For example, FP-1 for deep strikes, FP-2 for heavier local devastation, and even larger projects like the FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile in parallel. And the Russian terrorists will have a harder time protecting rear area refineries, fuel storages, and depots, because those are big, fixed, and expensive to fully defend. The fact is, you cannot put air defenses over every pipeline or pump station, especially those scattered over such a large territory like in Russia. And we've already seen some of those most massive drone strikes this year. So in the observable future, we can expect even more targeted hits, more disruption to logistics, and more headaches for all those terrorists who thought that being far from the front lines means being safe. To finish, my dear friends and family, basically what we're seeing here is Ukraine building smart, cheap, and effective tools that hit exactly where the Russian invaders feel secure. It's basically like teaching a bully that his backyard isn't off limits anymore. And honestly, the more the Russian media report those suspicious, unexpected incidents at their refineries and power plants, the more I smile, because, my friends, karma works. So stay informed, share this content so people hear what's actually happening, and subscribe if you want more updates. I'm Operator Starsky. As always, be safe, and I'll see you in the comments.